I'm the president of the Commercial and Industrial Workers Union and a member of the Liberation Movement. I want to start by talking about the Aragalaya and what defined the Aragalaya. The Aragalaya was by and large consisting of very, very young segment of our society. It was headed by the youth, it was carried forward by the youth. There were children as young as 17 who participated in the Aragalaya very actively. So when we have a really, really old president who has been in politics for over nearly 40 years, and he comes to power on this Aragalaya, which was headed by the youth, and he starts crushing active protesters, what we see is an old elite leadership which is afraid of the upcoming young new leadership. So they are crushing it. They are crushing the future of our country, which our youth dreamt through this Aragalaya. So that is how I would see the crushing of the protesters through using criminal law and the arrest and detention of Vasantha, Hashan and Siridhamma. And they have been kept for nearly 43 days, over 43 days, in dark, isolated cells, which is torture, basically. So they are being tortured for 43 days by the state. So while I ask why the state and why this state headed by an old, outdated, elite leadership is doing this, I also want to enlighten on laws such as the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which they are using to crush our protesters. Now, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, by and large, is not spoken about in the South because for 40 years, it has been largely used against Tamils, and then after the Easter Sunday, it was used against the Muslims. But now, we have 3 boys who have been detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act without an iota of evidence against them, and they have been called terrorists. The Prevention of Terrorism Act, as we all know, you don't need any evidence to identify someone as a terrorist, to issue a detention order against them. It is entirely at the whim and fancy of the defense minister that a person is identified and detained as a terrorist. Confessions are admissible, and confessions, as we know, is obtained through torture. So in those days, they used to commit physical torture and obtain confessions. And these days, when it comes to Vasantha, Hashan and Siridhamma, they are practicing psychological torture in obtaining statements from them. So now the Ranil Wickremesinghe government is coming and saying, we want to repeal the PTA, we want to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and we want to bring in a new act called the National Security Act in keeping with international standards. I want to remind everyone who is looking at this so-called progressive move by this government of repealing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, that when it comes to terror laws, there is an ideology behind it. And the ideology is that the state wants to empower the executive, the president, the law enforcement, the armed forces, and it wants to cut down the judicial scrutiny on what the executive wants to do. So whether it be the Prevention of Terrorism Act, whether it be the Counter Terror Act, which was brought in 2018, or the Counter Terror Bill, which was brought in 2018, and now whether it be the National Security Act, it is all terror laws which is going to be based on this principle that the executive should be empowered at the expense of the judiciary. And finally, most recently, we also have the Rehabilitation Bureau, which is coming up, which is supposedly to rehabilitate misguided combatants and groups of people who are prone to violence. Now, I was reading this bill yesterday, and my heart actually turned cold because it reminded me of centers which are created, or centers, or what I would call camps, which are created by repressive regimes to detain mass groups of people, to incarcerate mass groups of people, and beat out any kind of dissenting ideology which they may have against the ruling class. So this is what we are going to see in the future. We are going to see a Rehabilitation Bureau being created where torture is now legal under this bureau. where the military can torture people into submission, where the military can torture large groups of people, including students, including anyone who dissents against the government into submission. And what has been happening as illegal so far is now going to become legal. So therefore, if anyone in our society is thinking that the arrest and detention of the three students, Vasanta Mudalige, Hashan and Sridhamma, is going to start and end with them, I hope to enlighten you that this is just the beginning, and we are going to see mass incarceration of people, torture, death, disappearances, if we do not start voicing against this old elite, our rulers who are old and elite and outdated. If we do not start voicing our dissent against what they have been doing against our youth who led the Aragalya. Thank you.